Hi, listeners. It's Dr. Resa Lewiss. I'm taking some time to launch MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact. To that end, over the next few weeks, I will be airing podcast episodes hosted by other podcasters. These are friends who spoke with me and Dr. Adaira Landry about our book, MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact.
Resa and I are educators at heart and by training. And so I think coming at it from that angle, and that's why we have this very structured way of laying out the book, it's really with this mindset of how do we teach this to people versus a lot of comparative titles we're looking at early on when we were drafting the book. You know, they're written by business executives who might not have the idea of thinking about the holistic person and that self-sacrifice won't work for everyone. And this idea of also that you really have to teach things, like you have to be an educator, not just a writer.
This is the Visible Voices podcast.
Hey, Resa, what are you doing?
What?
I am the host of the Visible Voices podcast.
I thought I was just going to...
Nope. I am the host this week. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's start from the top. This is the Visible Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Soledad O'Brien. This week, I am taking over the mic and I'm guest hosting for a very special episode. I am so glad to bring you my conversation with Drs. Resa Lewiss and Adaira Landry. And you might know that they've written an amazing book. It's called MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about these two physician authors. Dr. Adaira Landry is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. She studied and trained at UC Berkeley and a bunch of other places. She's also an entrepreneur, a keynote speaker, and an award-winning mentor. And she co-founded Writing in Color, which is a nonprofit that teaches the craft of writing. Dr. Resa Lewiss is a professor of emergency medicine, TED Med speaker, Time's Up Healthcare founder. She studied at Brown University and also the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. When I'm not here, which is every other time, she is the actual host of the Visible Voices podcast, which amplifies content in the healthcare, equity, and current trends spaces. Resa and Adaira are now published authors, and today we are here to talk about their new book. So with all of that said, let's hop right into the conversation. Dr. Adaira Landry and Dr. Resa Lewiss. It is so ridiculous that I'm interviewing the two of you who have multiple degrees behind your names, but it's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation. Do I have to call you Doctor? Do I get to call you by your first names? How do you want to proceed?
It's wonderful to be here with you, and I am so delighted to be called Resa.
Same, totally an honor, and Adaira works wonderfully.
I just would like you to know for the record that if I ever become a doctor, it'll be like, oh, that's Dr. O'Brien to both of you. Anyway, it's so nice to chat about this book because it's a great book. And because I'm a TV news person, I'm going to hold it up at shoulder height because that's how we do it. But when I was sort of 2 chapters into this book, I was thinking, I've got to get more books because this is a perfect book to hand off to people who are starting careers and kind of navigating their way or trying to really figure out skills, right? And life skills and workplace skills. So it's really super. So I appreciate that I got a review copy, but now I got to go get more copies pretty much for everybody. Why don't we start by talking about what a micro skill is? Because of course, you say micro skills, small actions, big impact. But the part that I find really accurate and clever is buy this book on Friday, be better at your job on Monday, because that's kind of how I felt as I was reading through it. So what's a micro skill?
It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a small building block, a fundamental skill that you can use to navigate a larger goal that you might have. And this really is born out of our own personal experience navigating the workplace. I remember when I was just starting out at, a very large academic institution, my direct boss was this key opinion leader, thought leader, expert who was being invited to give talks everywhere and was doing consulting and writing books and all of these things that really just established expertise. And I remember thinking, like, how does one attain that level of knowledge, reputation, need, and demand? Like, how does that happen? And it really wasn't clear to me. There was this idea of like, you need to be driven. You need to say yes to everything, which, we talk about in the book as not being a great strategy, but there really wasn't a roadmap. And that was my entry into, okay, to navigate the workplace, like you have to learn how to do all of these small little tasks that will get you to that larger goal. And I think that's what we wanted to carry out through this book, is that we understand that people have lofty ambitions, large ambitions, but they just might not know how to get there.
And I'll throw in that, as emergency doctors, we have to learn procedures like sewing up a cut, or in the book, we talk about a cardiac arrest, and all the steps required to, number one, learn how to sew a cut or run a code. And even for non-medical listeners, we think about even back in the day when people tied shoes, all the steps to learn how to tie a shoe. I remember like opening up, pull out the tongue, slip in your shoe, put your heel down, pull the laces taut. All those skills, all those steps got the ultimate goal of tying the shoe.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think often the advice that people give is very much like, you need to learn to network. You need to learn to reach out to people. Hey, listen, you've just got to get out there. Say yes. But actually, I think for people who are new in their careers, or even people who are not so new, but trying to figure out how to navigate something new in their career, like, how do I do that? How do I build people who are going to agree with me at the end of our conversation? How do I actually do it is kind of a 20-step process, not just the network. It reminds me of I make a zillion New Year's resolutions each year. And it's like, 1, lose weight, 2, run a 10K, 3, eat healthily, and I get none of those things done because of course I don't actually have the steps to it. Why do you think, and maybe Resa, I'll start with you, why this book now?
It's a great question. There's a reason why it's now for Adaira and Resa, and then there's a why is it now and good for readers. This was a proof of concept solution, meaning during the pandemic, Adaira and I started writing articles, and we saw that these articles really landed well with general audiences of navigating the workplace, whether it was our articles on mentorship or on how to get paid for a speaking gig or how to share accomplishments on social media. We were able to publish in, for example, Harvard Business Review, Fast Company. And I share those to say, like, okay, what we were seeing and experiencing and learning in our work industry, healthcare, was resonating broadly. And we both had started in medicine with different paths, different experiences, different journeys, but a lot of overlapping stories of like, gosh, I really wish someone had told us these things. And there was a playbook. And I definitely felt I didn't have this playbook. So these articles kind of were the consequences of these learning experiences. And Adaira said to me, Resa, I want to write a book. And the book was the combination of these workplace solutions that we had learned that we wish we had learned sooner, more efficiently, et cetera. The reason it's now for this time period for people entering the workforce, people entering college, people early career, and even, thank goodness, we've heard people in their 60s and 70s say, hey, I even learned something, is, people want to be better. They want to learn how to be better. And when we did this deep dive into the business self-help collection of books, many said to, as you shared, go out and do it, but no one really said how. And we were like, let's tell people how.
And I think one of the important aspects of who we are is that we are, yes, physicians who care deeply about self-care, self-compassion. We didn't want to write a book that sort of preached this idea of put your head down, grind away, sacrifice yourself. We really wanted to tell.
We all have that book, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And it really doesn't work for many people for long. We really wanted to write something that emphasized that success does not mean self-sacrifice. And so we have a lot of content about just caring for the self, the mind, the body, our physical health, our financial health. The other thing is that Resa and I are educators at heart and by training. We've had positions where we are responsible with teaching early career professionals how to navigate their career. Like that's been parts of our job. And so I think coming at it from that angle, and that's why we have this very structured way of laying out the book, it's really with this mindset of how do we teach this to people versus a lot of comparative titles we're looking at early on when we were drafting the book. They're written by business executives, older white men who might not have the idea of thinking about the holistic person and that self-sacrifice won't work for everyone. And this idea of also that you really have to teach things, like you have to be an educator, not just a writer.
You both tell lots of stories, great stories, by the way, in this book. And they're all stories about, for the most part, being emergency room doctors, of course. But I didn't really get the feeling that this was like, this is a book if you're going into, medicine and you want to be an ER doctor. It felt like it had so many applications for anybody who's trying to navigate something. I assume, Adaira, that was very intentional, or maybe there's just an overlap. Like a workplace is a workplace to some degree with some little differences in there.
I think people were initially quite curious about how two emergency medicine doctors were going to be able to write a book for everyone. But the truth is, we are employees, we are colleagues, we have not necessarily customers, but we have patients who are in the customer service business. And so all of the themes of interacting with people at the same level above us, right? We have bosses and supervisors. And then we have, like I said, this clientele, this customer base, this patient base. It's all very similar when it comes to navigating conflict, learning how to communicate. All of the chapters that we discussed, we thought were really widely applicable across industries. But yeah, I think people were really interested in how much emergency medicine was going to be in the book. And we definitely threw stories in that we felt like really demonstrated emergency medicine, but also didn't alienate a general audience.
I'd like to dig into the skills now specifically. Is there a micro skill that each of you would say is like, hey, this is the one that really was the key, and from that one, everything else sort of followed? Resa, why don't you start us off?
I'll start with one of my faves, which is in the chapter on networking, and specifically the micro skill on networking for introverts. I'm a big reader. I love books, and I had spent years going to professional conferences and realizing that the activities didn't completely resonate with me and were very draining. And I started realizing how I'm not shy. I'm socially adept. I can speak in front of hundreds, thousands of people. I can actually be at a cocktail party of strangers. However, I am deeply introverted. The way I recharge, where I get my energy is solo or one-on-one. Whether it's reading a book, whether it's walking in nature, whether it's having coffee shop meetings. And that's not the way most workplaces and workplace big conferences and events are made. And so I started doing all these adaptive behaviors. So rather than staying at the main conference venue, I would stay at a venue nearby, but I could scuttle off. Or rather than going to the large department dinner, I would reserve a table for 4 and just have a really deeper conversation dinner. And I found that I had relationships stick better, that was a better way for me to grow my network. And then I read this book that kind of gave some of the same things that I had learned over time. And I just think that concept of breaking it down and figuring out piece by piece how to make something work was really illustrative for this concept of micro skills.
How about for you, Adaira? Was there one micro skill where you'd say, if you can only pick one, and you cover so many in the book, but if you were forced to pick like your fave, your number one, what would it be?
Pause before accepting an opportunity. I think that is the fundamental aspect of the workplace, is just being very cautious of what you say yes to, what you say no to, what you say maybe later to. And I think that's where a lot of us get sort of dragged down into this cycle vortex of burnout, is that we aren't really great at triaging. And I like to use that word triage because we're emergency medicine doctors, but we're not really great at triaging the stuff that comes to us. So I think we emphasize the idea of like, it's okay to say, can I have some time to think about it? It's okay to ask probing questions, to ask, tell me more. Like, is there funding? Will I have an administrative assistant? Has anyone here done anything similar to this? Is there a place where I'm going to put this work, like a way to demonstrate my efforts, any sort of measurable outcomes? Just asking those questions earlier on will really allow you to see if something has red flags. And then you still take time and say, do you mind if I spend some time thinking about this, speaking with my network, my personal board of directors, just to make sure I'm not missing anything else? And taking time to actually run an idea past someone else is a really amazing thing, a skill, honestly, that I didn't know until much later in my career. I was totally a subscriber to the idea of say yes to everything, because that's what was told to me when I was a college student, a medical student, even a resident. Like, you don't know what you're missing out on, so you should say yes to everything. And then what happened? Well, I did. I said yes to everything and I got bogged down. And, you start missing deadlines, you start pushing things back, things start dropping through the cracks. I know I've been there many times and it's still a work in progress for me. But I know much more about taking that pause and triaging those questions early on.
Yeah, I think that's a great example because I think those of us who are successful kind of got there because of those things, right? We are type A, we push through, we say yes, we deliver. But there comes a point where it's like the law of diminishing returns and you recognize like, actually, I don't want to say that yes to this, or I don't need to build these things. Do you think, Adaira, I'll continue with you and then maybe Resa, you can hop in. Do you think it's a woman thing? Because I personally, anecdotally, of course, it just feels like a lot of women have gotten ahead because they're great at just getting stuff done. But then when you get to a certain level in your career, it's no longer about, wow, they're such a good doobie. It really is about who are you meeting with? Who are your power players? Who supports you behind the scenes? And that, oh, she's so reliable. Boy, I can call her and she'll do it, is less valuable. So I guess I'm asking, were you guys thinking of like, this is a book for women, or did you feel like this is a book for everybody?
We definitely think that this book is for everyone. And we also know that women read more books than men do. In regards to this idea of what you're probably describing as non-promotable work, I didn't actually know that term until like 2 years ago.
I just heard it for the first time right now. I'm going to write it down.
And I did not coin that, but it's a term that I think really conceptualizes what you're describing, which is like all of those administrative duties. Planning mixers, women's mixers, those are things that just don't necessarily require my skill set as a doctor, right? I went to medical school, and yet for many years, I was in charge of planning mixers and dinners, which again, like important work, but I don't know if you necessarily need someone to do that who's gone through medical school. And so just recognizing your own skill set and like the work that you're being tasked to do and seeing if that matches is an important first step. I don't think this book is just for women, because I do think that men can get bogged down into this sort of thing. But I think you're exactly right, which is that the word reliable can actually hinder us, because then it's just something that, we keep coming back to. Let's give this like low hanging fruit task to someone because we know they'll get it done, not because we know it will advance their career. And there's a lot of data that women in the workplace like to be people pleasers. We are less likely to stand up and sort of take a stance on like, this is not the best thing for me. And so that arguably sets us up to say yes to some of these non-promotable tasks.
I'll say in the book, we talk about turning FOMO, fear of missing out, into JOMO, joy of missing out. And I also know this book is written for everybody because that's our intention. And also, when we've been on similar podcasts, plenty of our cis hetero white men colleagues have been like, I wish I had this book, or I can't tell you how many of the errors I made. This book would have helped me. And, what you ask about is also termed, I'm sure you've heard this, office housework. And I'm going to reference another book I read called How Women Rise. And I think all the things that we all did to get to where we were, How Women Rise says that won't get you to the next level. And that brings in what I just shared about networking, because the context of why we even have a chapter on networking is the importance of a network and where it gets you, the opportunities, the rooms, the conversations, the projects, everything. And so I think we may not get the messaging of how to get to the next level. And that's why the things that maybe help us succeed to a certain point don't do that. And those are the next pieces of information we need.
Let's talk a little bit about networking. Was that one of your micro skills for either of you for your personal life? Because I'm going to assume that some of these things about saying yes and no, as much as they overlap into personal life, are really sort of work events foisted upon you in your personal life. So is there a micro skill that you would say, hey, listen, just for me personally in my life, here's what was helpful? Because I would have put networking, weirdly, sounds like a very work-related skill, but it actually has huge benefits and ramifications in your personal life. And I think networking for friends and for finding somebody to mow your lawn and for finding a babysitter and for finding a last minute babysitter when your other babysitter has canceled. And, just like that kind of networking I have found would be like my number one skill that I have to acquire to make the rest of my personal life move along smoothly. So Resa, why don't you start us off on this? What was your micro skill that's most important for you personally?
I'll say, this goes back to these building blocks, these micro skills, that they're not isolated little units. They're actually additive and they translate to other skills. And so what you just shared about networking, basically there's a Venn diagram overlap with personal board of directors. And, I just shared about the book about how women rise. So we did a chapter on networking because we think it's that important for navigating not just the workplace, but yeah, sure, also definitely personal life. And there's overlap. And we talk about relationships. And this goes from the assumption that not everybody starts at the same place and not everybody has the same network or the same social skills or the same situational awareness or emotional intelligence, all these nice catch terms. And so I tell a story in the book about I had identified someone that I was sure was going to be a mentor. And I tried really, really hard. We finally met. And then I was even more energized, like, this is it. This person has the career path that I want to follow, and I'm sure it's going to be. And then there kept being canceled meetings, and it was really hard. And finally, I was like, they don't want to have this working relationship of mentor-mentee. And the relationship wasn't sticking. And so that's a micro skill in the chapter under networking of, make relationships and find relationships that stick, and that there is an organic aspect to these. And we agree, network sounds very transactional and kind of creepy sometimes. So sometimes I say connections because connections feel more human and heartfelt. So within that chapter, not only the one on introverts, but also the one on make relationships that stick is a fave.
And how about for you, Adaira?
For me, definitely thinking back to the longevity of my career, positioning myself to be financially independent was quite important. Just because growing up, I didn't really have much modeling for how to manage money and how to make sure that I'm not financially obligated to work. That was really important to me. It's important to me to feel a sense of relief and control when it comes to managing my day to day. And I think a lot of that is actually centered around financial health. And I bring that up a lot because I feel like we don't talk about it early enough when people are just entering the workplace, how to manage your money. It wasn't until I was about 25 that I even started to think about retirement. And doctors actually enter this whole financial planning stage quite late. This is largely because we have humongous student loans. Not everyone, but many of us do. And so we're so bogged down by this idea of paying off $300,000 in loans, I know some people who owe $700,000 in student loans. So you're just in this trap of debt and you're not even thinking about, one day I would like to retire and I need that to be possible. So I need to start saving for that day. And so I think that one's really important because there is this sense of freedom that comes when you are financially stable. And I'm not implying like wealthy aspirations here where you're buying yachts or anything. That's not my life either. I'm just saying the idea where if you wanted to, let's say, even go part-time, instead of working 5 days a week, you work 4 days a week. Being able to afford to do that is important.
I think for people who have lots of debt, my little brother is an anesthesiologist. And I remember at one point, like the number was so big of what he owed that it almost felt not real, right? Like, so if you owe 300,000 or 315,000 or 325,000, like really, it's all unpayable at this moment. So
exactly.
what's the difference? And I love this particular chapter because again, you don't just tell people, listen, think about money. You got to save money, right? It's actually the steps to help yourself become more financially responsible. I think that was really a good read. There were a couple of things that I was surprised by because I hadn't really thought of them before. You talk about brainstorming expertise. What does that even mean? What does it mean to brainstorm your expertise?
A lot of what I do for my career is I help early career professionals figure out their niche, what it is they want to do. And sometimes it's just practicing clinical medicine. And sometimes someone wants to become an NIH-funded researcher, and they know that they want to do this sort of thing. But many students, many early career professionals are a bit lost, and they don't really know exactly what it is they want to do. And I have found that's largely because they're not fully exposed to what's possible. And I will say that when I was an early intern, I had lunch with another Black woman physician, Dr. Uche Blackstock. And she sat across from me at a diner and she said, Adaira, did you know that there's so much you can do with your MD? You can do consulting, you can write books, you can give lectures. And she just, gave me this huge list of things that I had never even considered. And so I think the idea of brainstorming your potential area of expertise really comes from being just inspired to figure out what's possible for you and to write a very, very long list. I give an example all the time about my kids. If I were to ask my 5-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up? She's going to almost always say doctor because mommy's a doctor and daddy's a doctor. Daddy's a doctor of computers, but he still has a PhD, so we call him doctor. And she would never say architect because she doesn't even know that that job is possible. And so it really just speaks to this idea of early exposure and trying your hardest to be as creative and pushing boundaries as possible.
I'm going to ask you, Resa, about the other one that I had never heard before, nurturing your local reputation. I mean, I always thought either you have a reputation, and usually that might not be so good, or you don't have a reputation. But what's your local reputation as opposed to any other kind of reputation? And how do you nurture it?
So this is in the context of growing your expertise. And what happens is people can become national, even international experts and be asked to fly around the United States, around the world, give lectures, write papers, and start doing all these projects, all these items that develop their subject matter expertise outside of their institution, outside of their team, at the company, at the hospital, at the industry where they are working. And we talk about the importance of first taking care of yourself, but also taking care of your team. And part of being a good team player is continuing to not neglect your roles and responsibilities where you work. Continue to nurture your relationships with your teammates and to make sure that ultimately that work gets done and that work does not get ignored.
That's such great advice because I do think there are people who you see them skyrocket ahead in some capacity, right? But at some point, I believe, and maybe it's karma, whatever we can call it, whatever, right? At some point, it catches up because the people locally say, actually, this is what they've done. This is who they are. I think it really does what do they say? The chickens come home to roost in some capacity. And I think that is the local reputation. I feel like you guys talk a lot about email. And I felt when I was reading it, like email, all we do is email. We all live on email. Why did you want to walk us through some things that I would have thought like your mental health and how you're taking care of yourself, email, these things are a part of our daily life, but we tackle them already.
I'll start and say that this is a bit of an extension of one of our articles about a compassionate email culture.
And what? Back up. A compassionate.
I know.
Explícame, por favor.
Explícame. Sí. Claro. So we're very proud of this concept. So we all are always battling the inbox, and we've read and heard about inbox zero. But in our article, we flipped it 180. We said, rather than being concerned about your own email inbox, be concerned, think about other people's email inbox. Be compassionate. And so we actually started with this concept of MicroSkills for having a compassionate email culture. And in the article, we talked about the functioning of the CC. One of the hot hits that we get asked a lot about is understanding the value, the importance, and the utilization of the BCC. Not that it's punitive, but it actually is one of respect, and it can be very, very useful to everybody's inbox. And we talk about other things about when to send emails, how to schedule that send. And I'll hand the baton to Adaira to continue about why email.
I would say in most workplaces, it's our main mode of communication. There are some exceptions, I'm sure, in like the completely virtual world where people are using other software, outlets like Slack or Microsoft Teams. But I think a lot of people still rely heavily on email. And as Resa said, I was really hardcore about inbox zero and unsubscribe all. And I would, try my hardest to get down to, less than 20 emails a day. But there were still these like emails that kept coming to me, not necessarily in high frequency, but just odd timing, weekends, nights, holidays, while I'm on maternity leave. And some of them were, I think, constructed in a way or designed in a way that they were just setting themselves up for this like reply all catastrophe that happens. Like when you're putting 500 people on the to line and everyone starts replying all. And then now all of a sudden one email becomes 30. So it was just a matter of like, what are some small things that we can do? And we really do think they're small that would just take one area of stress down a few notches, right? We're not saying eliminate email. We're just saying be thoughtful in how you use it. Think about the other person who's receiving it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd never really thought about the other person. I'm a person who wants to clear her inbox. I like lists and I like crossing things off my list, but I do have a real problem with someone who sends me an email on vacation. I do have a real problem with somebody who sends me an email at 3:00 in the morning. I think if people knew how much the other person hates it, that they would stop, right? Because often it's an ask. Hey, can you do such and such? And you're like, never, I will never do this because I am in Haiti covering an earthquake and you are filling up my email box with like, hey, I'm wondering if I can get 5 minutes on the phone. You're like, you have no idea what I'm doing. And it's so frustrating. So I really think you work against yourself when you send those badly timed emails.
If I can add, we get it because we're shift workers and often shifts are at all hours. So one micro skill that we include that we really like is we have colleague friends who add a line to their email signature that says, there's the I only check email these days of the week, these hours, or we have colleagues that say I work nights only. So I may send emails at this time. There is no expectation that you respond. That being said, we do know that still when all of us get something in the inbox, there is this feeling that we need to do and respond.
Yeah, I send it to my assistant and other people who work for me very clearly. This is for Monday because Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning is a really good time for me to clean out my email box. But being on the receiving end, I'm like, don't even look at it. I'm sending this, so it's in your box now, but don't even look at it till Monday. And I think that's helped a little bit. Resa, I thought the chunk about gratitude was really interesting. You share a story, and I would think of myself as a person who really is grateful for a lot of stuff. I've had some success at work. I feel like I've checked every box when it comes to being lucky, which has been nice. But I thought that you took it a step further in the story you tell. You talk about the note that you wrote to the person who you were feeling gratitude toward. And I thought, I've only sort of been feeling grateful, right? People are like, make sure you make a gratitude journal, write down for yourself how grateful you feel. But I love the idea of like actually giving the other person a tangible reminder of the reason you got gratitude in the first place. Can you explain that to folks?
Yeah, I love the question. And also I love that you used the word chunk to describe some of the organization of our book because we organized it in chunks and there are story chunks.
It's kind of encyclopedic. I don't know. I don't know that that's a word. I made it up, but it's like an encyclopedia, right? It's very clear and linear and steps with narrative stories in between to connect everything. And I think that makes it very helpful to learn those skills. Sorry to interrupt you, but go ahead.
No, and also, you asked why emergency medicine stories that we put in. So part of it is, it's true, that's where we've spent most of our workplace time. But also, to be clear, our editor said, what I do, people don't die. It's not life or death. People want to hear those stories. And I'm sure you go to dinner parties and people want to hear the stories you covered, the people with whom you spoke. So the same thing happens. When we go to dinner parties, everybody wants a doctor's story.
Yeah.
So the one to which you're referring about gratitude, to be clear, growing up, I definitely had the lesson attempted of you should write a thank you note. You get a birthday card, you get a fill in the blank, write a thank you note. And there's a little bit of an eye roll and resistance when you're a kid. And also, I actually believe in handwritten thank you notes. And they are sincere, they are authentic, they are not performative. So I was working as a doctor in training with a senior doctor, and a patient came in. She was very clearly dying of metastatic cancer. The family did not seem to have any awareness. So on that shift with the senior doctor, we went into the family room and had the conversation. I saw him very skillfully lead the conversation and help the family come to a decision about her advanced directives, what was going to be done, what was not going to be done. And within a short period of time, then I was the doctor in charge working in a community hospital. Patient came in, he had cancer. He was sick, but not so sick that it was going to be his time that visit that he would die. I got along with him and his partner, and he got admitted to the hospital, didn't think anything of it. About 3 weeks later, he returned. I didn't even recognize him because his cancer had progressed. His partner recognized me. She's like, "Oh, hi, doctor. Do you remember me?" And then I had to take a double take. And he was very sick. And I knew it was not good on this visit in terms of ultimately him surviving. And she said, "I'm going to go get something to eat. Do you think he's going to be admitted?" And I shared this often happens that it's very clear to us how sick people are and that of course they're going to be admitted to the hospital, but family members may or may not realize, and also not medical. So I pulled her into a room and conducted a conversation similar to what I had witnessed that senior physician hold. And I walked her through what needed to be done. I told her that he was very sick and that she should call the adult children and ask them to come to the hospital. And she thanked me. She got it. And I found out the next day she came to find me. I wasn't working in the emergency department, but she told the nurses to pass on her thanks. And then I ultimately wrote a thank you note to that senior physician, telling him what I had learned. And because of that experience with him, I was able to hold this conversation. And he has told me that he still has that note and he takes it out once in a while to read it.
I thought, Adaira, a story that you told that was great was about conflict, and not just the classic, like, here's how to avoid conflict, but like how to recognize your own role in conflict. I think anybody who's got kids, right, recognize the classic is kid one hits kid two. Kid two starts crying and then does something back, right? And then it's like, because they each have this role in conflict, it gets messier in how to figure out, who's really responsible. And I thought your story about seeing your own role in conflict was really helpful, because I think most of us do that. We feel wronged and we come back at the person. Can you explain that story?
Sadly, there are many stories like this in the emergency room because it's so high stress. People can inadvertently say things that can unfortunately heighten the situation further. In my case, I think I learned early on about it, just this idea of recognizing conflict. Luckily, when I was maybe, first or second year, I think it was like a third-year resident. But I had a surgeon come into a very critical case. This patient was really sick, needed a lot of emergency intervention. And this particular resident had a reputation of speaking over women, especially, but just speaking over the emergency medicine doc. There's a hierarchy within medicine that some people believe still exists, where some people are able to speak over others. And so I believe that this person believed in this sort of archaic structure. And so I am supposedly running this trauma, and the surgeon comes in and just starts shouting orders at me. And I engage basically back. And at the end of the whole session, we debrief and talk about what happened. And I do ultimately apologize for my behavior. And I think that's important because I didn't want to minimize the impact of his behavior, but I also wanted to recognize how I contributed. And I thought that was just an important distinction, because sometimes when people are wrong to us, it can be easy for us to say, it's okay, no problem, don't worry about it, especially for big things. And so the distinction here is that, yes, he ultimately apologized too, but my apology didn't really undermine the need for him to apologize.
I think this book is just great. I had thought when I had heard you guys were going to write this book that it was going to be a book about like lowering your cholesterol, or here's why you need to get fat out of your diet, or what, emergency doc stuff. And I am so glad that you've kind of used the lens of emergency medicine, high stress, high stakes, lots of people, lots of different people, lots of people who aren't really put together because they all get along and kumbaya. Like sometimes you're all just in the room at the same time, which is really like every single workplace I've ever been in. And I think the advice is really, really great. So thank you so much for talking with me about your book. Congratulations on it. And Resa, thank you for letting me take over the mic on your podcast to interview you guys about it. I really appreciate it.
It's been delightful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just honored that you are supporting us so much. So I really appreciate you.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, guys. So for our listeners, I can't tell you how much fun this was speaking with these two authors. I really appreciate Resa and Adaira inviting me to host this interview. And I thought I could share a couple of highlights from the conversation and really highlights from the book. First and foremost, I think the book is organized in a great way. I mean, I love to call it chunky because it's not like reading through a novel. It actually, you can just kind of go to the section you need information on and you can read it. And it's broken down into really thoughtful categories. And I just love reading books like that, especially when they're trying to give you advice about very specific things. It makes it incredibly helpful. My favorite part, and I've talked about this a lot actually, is the idea of gratitude. And I think it's my favorite part because I already know a lot about gratitude, but in the book, they take it a step further, right? It's not just saying, oh, I am so grateful for this person really helping me become better at a skill. It's that next step that actually circles back around to the original person, right? Writing the note that tells them the story then lands on their desk, which is something that kind of continues, I guess, paying it forward. I'm very grateful about a lot of things, but I've never actually put pen to paper to tell the people responsible for the thing I'm grateful for, how grateful I am. So I thought that was just a really good, important lesson. And lastly, what I like most about this book is I think they tackle very tough topics, right? Give you really good advice. It's not just, hey, get out there and network. Hey, put yourself out there. Hey, be organized. Hey, don't overspend what money you have. They really walk you through the things that they did well, the things that they messed up, and then teach you how to do that thing that you have to accomplish step by step by step. So I love this book, highly recommend it. And listen, if you have a graduate of anything, high school, college, graduate school, then you want to get this book for that person because it's really going to help them navigate the work life that they're now entering. I'm Soledad O'Brien, and this has been the Visible Voices podcast. And I'd say I'd see you next time, but actually, Resa's going to see you next time when she's back hosting her podcast.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices both known and unknown, discussing topics of healthcare, equity, and current trends. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa Lewiss. Please find me on social media at Resa Lewiss and through the website, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please rate and review us. Share the podcast with a friend today. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, to be continued.